I recall several decades ago, sir, I had applied to travel to one of these Western countries during a vacation, and I was bounced. And the reason was that I hadn't traveled out of Ghana before. A few months later, we attended Nigeria for the first time to attend a youth conference, and we were taken to the Obasanjo farms in Nota. So Nigeria is my gateway to Africa. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Your Excellency, my brother, the President of the Republic of Ghana, Your Excellency, my brother, the former President of Federal Republic of Nigeria, President Goodluck Jonathan, and who is the owner of the foundation that has brought us together. I was not supposed to be talking to you now, but the executive director of Goodluck Jonathan Foundation came to me as I was sitting by Bishop Kukah, who is supposed to give a keynote address. I was supposed to have a fireside chat, and I was prepared for that. I don't know where the fire will come from, but I was prepared for a chat. Then she came to me and said, "Do you mind saying something now?" I said, "But you did not warn me that I will be saying something now." She said, "You should say something." Well, before I was then thinking, what should I say? What should I do? And I want to seek advice from the man on my left, and that Bishop Kukah, to say, "Bishop Kukah, what do I say?" And I thought he would probably be saying, "Say in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." And even before I could ask him, then the lady, who is the mistress of the ceremony, called me up. And you see me coming up feeling unprepared, untutored. Yes. And I listened to the president of ECOWAS, who ended on 3 notes. I will start on 3 notes too. And probably we will deliberate more on those 3 points as the day goes by. Democracy dies because democracy has refused to be reformed. There are 3 aspects of democracy that cannot continue to exist the way it was as defined by the American president. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. And in that definition, democracy is meant to be all people's action. And if democracy will not die and be buried, not just die and be buried, democracy must be reformed in context, in content, and in practice. In my part of the world, we have a saying that the thing that killed the vegetable is the insect in the vegetable. The thing that is killing democracy, and we kill it, is the practice of democracy. All the essentials that should be part and parcel of democracy are being ignored or are being bastardized in such a way that democracy has failed to deliver, and democracy cannot deliver unless it is reformed. And if it's not reformed, it will not only fail, it will die, and it will be buried. And yet, there's not any real substitute for democracy as it was originally designed. Government of the people, all the people. What we have now is not government of the people, it's government of some people, by some people, over all the people. And they talk of government democracy as government of the majority. If you talk of government of the majority, what do you do with the minority? Then minority is not part of the people. I hope as we go on tonight, today, we will deliberate on this, and probably we will find a means by which we will put new life into democracy through democratic reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And let me take a moment to recognize the presence of the Speaker of the 55th Legislature House of Representatives of the Republic of Liberia, Honorable Richard Nagbe-Kun. Honorable, we acknowledge your presence. And we also recognize the presence of the Nigerian community in Ghana who are represented here, and to the future of our democracy, the students from the Accra High Senior High School and Osu Presbyterian School who are here, the bridge to the future. Let's give them all a round of applause. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite the presence of our host, His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Ghana, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, to deliver his opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Shamima. Thank you, please. Resume your seats. Thank you very much. Let me proceed on established protocol. I think my daughter Shamima has acknowledged everybody. And so I'll just say a few preliminary words about the subject, and then after that I'll read a very short speech that I've been given. As a student of history, I always like to go back into the past. And we've had various stages of the development of our democracy. And every stage is important because we have to take lessons learned in order that we come out better. And so the first stage was the liberation of the African continent, of which Ghana played a very significant role. Yeah, Ghanaians, you can clap for that. And actually became the launch pad of the African liberation movement. As young children, We knew that Kaunda, Mugabe, and all of them lived in Ghana and held Ghanaian passports, diplomatic passports, to prevent them from being harassed or arrested. And so there was the excitement that if we came under self-rule and we governed ourselves, prosperity will naturally come. Unfortunately, Ghana again, the pioneer in most things, quickly dispatched our first president in a coup, and then our Nigerian cousins also followed, and all the other countries followed. And our countries went under military rule. It's been a rotating window of military governments return to constitutional democracy, military governments return to constitutional democracy. And in Ghana's case, of course, we had the NLC, the National Liberation Council, and then we had the a Progressive Party government, UP government under Dr. Buzia. Then, of course, the National Redemption Council, the Supreme Military Council, then to the Third Republic under the PNP, Dr. Liman. Then came the June 4, and back to democracy, and then after a long period under military rule, we came to a consensus, and it was like the Arab Spring for Africa, where we decided that we had had enough of military dictatorship, and that the people will be better served by democratic and constitutional governance. And so one by one, African countries began to pivot back to constitutional rule and democratic governance. But the thing is, democratic governance guarantees the rights and freedoms of the people, which is true, but in themselves will not bring opportunity and economic prosperity unless you abide by certain principles. And so Ghana went back to constitutional democracy in 1992. There was a lot of excitement about it. President Rawlings became the first civilian president of Ghana, followed by President Kukah. And since then, it's been a revolving door of NDC at one time for 8 years, MPP 2 comes for 8 years. But for those who attended my inauguration, if you were not on the Black Star Square and we had locked you in a room and you could hear the announcement of the acknowledgement of the presidents who were coming up to greet me, you'd have noticed that the loudest applause was for the countries that have overthrown democracy and are under military dictatorship. That should give us a pause for thought. That should make us think. And that should make us ask ourselves questions about why democracies die. And that's why the topic of today is relevant. What are the things we need to do to sustain democracy? Democracy will not survive by itself if we don't work for it. And like Omar Toure said, whatever system of government you have, autocracy, democracy, theocracy, whatever, if it does not deliver opportunities and prosperity to the people, it will not survive. And so, next. Sadly disappeared because all the Afrobarometer surveys and all the other surveys they did, and in many of these surveys they added the question, do you prefer democratic government or would you support a coup d'etat? And it was frightening to notice that a lot of our young people said they would prefer to live under a military government. And so that should give us pause for thought. And that is why I said that we need a reset of our democracy. We need a reset of our economy. We need a reset of our governance. We need to make our governance accountable. And that's why I say anybody who wants to serve in public office must be prepared to account to the people. The people are tired of the corruption. They're tired of misgovernance. They are tired of the lack of opportunity. And that is why for those of us who believe in democracy, we must continue to take the advantage of dialogues like this to see what is wrong with our implementation of democracy so that we can make a reset that makes the youth continue to have faith in democratic governance and not romanticize unconstitutional government. So these are just a few words I thought we'll talk about, but also to mention the role of the new media. We don't have the traditional TV and radios as the main source of information now. Anybody puts a camera in front of his face and can make a commentary on anything. And so there again, how do we accommodate the new media in democratic consolidation? Maybe that might be the topic for the next democracy dialogue. And I think the executive director will take note of that. But this is the little speech I wrote, and so I'll go through that and just put my points on record. On behalf of the people and government of Ghana, I extend a warm welcome to you all. And I say Akwaba, what's that, Obake, Wezon, Sandezua. I mean, all our languages have the word welcome, and I think we accommodate everybody. It is our privilege and an honor to host the 2025 Democracy Dialogue. And we owe a debt of gratitude to President Goodluck Jonathan, who has been a towering pillar and whose life embodies the struggle for democracy, peace, and progress in Africa. And through this dialogue, he continues to remind us that democracy is not self-sustaining. It must be nurtured and defended. And I wish to thank all the important people who have come, President Olusegun Obasanjo, Peter Obi, and I mean too many to mention, to lend your presence to this all-important dialogue. Our theme, Why Democracy Dies, Why Democracies Die, is not a verdict but a warning. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Around the world, democratic systems are under strain. Václav Havel, the Czech statesman, once observed, democracy is not something that occurs once for all. It must be fought for every day. That is precisely the spirit of this dialogue we're undertaking. History offers us sobering lessons. In Latin America, democracies collapsed under juntas in the 70s, but later renewal came through truth, reconciliation, and strong institutions. In Asia, South Korea and Taiwan showed how democracies can thrive alongside economic growth, while Myanmar warns of reversals when militarism overwhelms institutions. In Europe, the rise of fascism in the 1930s teaches us how despair and demagoguery can corrode democracy. In the United States, Abraham Lincoln's immortal words still echo. He says, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." And yet, government of the people, by the people, for the people, survival is never guaranteed. Ghana has earned recognition as a beacon of democracy in Africa. And since 1992, we've witnessed peaceful transitions, a vibrant media, resilient civil society. But let us be candid. Some negatives in our politics threaten survival of democracy. Inequality, lack of opportunity for young people, monetization of our politics, misinformation, and all others pose grave risks to the survival of democracy. Kwame Nkrumah once warned, and I quote, he said, "Freedom is not something that one people can bestow on another as a gift. They claim it as their own, and none can keep it from them. Our people claim their freedom, but we must guard it jealously." This was Kwame Nkrumah. You could change freedom and put democracy, and it will be the same thing. So my question is, why democracies fail and why democracies die? The first one is weak institutions that fail to protect the rights of the people. The second is corruption and elite capture that erodes the trust of the people in democratic governance. The third is exclusion and inequality that alienate portions of the citizenry. The fourth is leadership deficits that squander legitimacy of governments. And the fifth is external pressures that exploit the vulnerability in democratic systems. And so, to renew democracy, we must do certain things. Of course, the first one is that we must strengthen institutions, independent courts, parliaments, and our electoral bodies. The second is that we must deliver development, because democracy without development, democracy without roads, democracy without schools, hospitals, and jobs will always be at risk. The third, we must educate our citizens. For us, Thomas Sankara said, and I quote, he said, "A soldier without political education or ideological training is a potential criminal." The same is true of leadership without ethical grounding. The fourth, we must protect media and civic space. A free press is democracy's immune system. We must also build regional solidarity, because the fall of democracy in one nation weakens democracy in all other nations. As host, Ghana recommits to upholding democracy, not just in rhetoric, but in practice. We'll defend the independence of our institutions, we'll support free expression, and we'll continue to stand with ECOWAS in promoting democratic governance across West Africa. Distinguished citizens, democracy dies when citizens lose faith, when leaders abandon integrity, and institutions succumb to capture. But democracy can be renewed when citizens rise to defend it. And as the former Czech President Havel said again, and I quote, he said, "The salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart." The survival of democracy depends on us, leaders, citizens, institutions, and for us choosing courage over complacency. And so let this dialogue in Accra be remembered not as a lament for dying democracies, but as a rebirth of hope. Let us leave here with a renewed determination to safeguard our democracies, to make our democracies deliver, and pass on to the future generations a legacy of freedom, justice, and dignity. And as an African proverb says, when the roots of the tree are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind. If the roots of our democracy are deep, there is no need to fear unconstitutional governance. If we deepen the roots of our democracy in our nations, it will withstand any storm. May God bless this gathering. May God bless Africa. And I wish you fruitful deliberation. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for His Excellency John Dramani in Mahama. Indeed, let us safeguard our democracy. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. It is now time, distinguished dignitaries, please resume your seats, to listen to our keynote speaker. But let's not make any assumption. In this room, all those in favor of democracy say aye. All those skeptical about democracy say aye. Some ayes have it. Anyway, so I think we can safely assume that many of us in this room today have hope that our democracy will sustain. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome to the podium our distinguished speaker in the person of Bishop Matthew Hassan Kukah, Catholic Bishop of Sokoto and founder of the Kukah Center. Please welcome him with a resounding round of applause.
I was hoping I could borrow the president's water, but I see that his orderly has taken the glass of water away. In Nigeria, we often say we're standing on existing protocols. And of course, when you are as vertically advantaged or disadvantaged as I am, you can understand why we need to stand on existing protocols. So Mr. President, former President Jonathan, President Obasanjo, the people from Nigeria, as you know, we have gained every right to be very supportive of everything that happens in Ghana. I was invited here, I've forgotten the year now, when the Ghanaians set up their own equivalent of Oputa Panel or the Truth Commission. By then, your former president, Nana Akufo, was the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And when I came, I made it very clear to the Ghanaians that I would be ready to answer the call from Ghana anytime for more than one reason. At least defeating the Black Stars was already a settled question. And of course, one player that I have difficulties forgiving is Thomas Partey, whose goal sent Nigeria out of Nigeria's hope of playing in the World Cup. But I support Thomas Partey because until recently he was a player of Arsenal. Anyway, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let me get very seriously to the matters of the day, and thank you so very much. I have no idea why President Jonathan honored me with this call, and actually when I accepted the invitation, I didn't expect an audience as distinguished as this. But now that the bottle of water has been brought, I tell you, please don't take it from my speech. A young priest who was posted to a community where, drinking alcohol was literally a pastime. And the concern was how to stop these people from drinking very cheap alcohol, because they were always drunk in the morning, most time of the day. So a young medical doctor came to the parish and introduced himself to the parish priest, that he was a medical doctor. And the parish priest said, look, on Sunday, I will read the gospel, and instead of a sermon, I will sit down and you will speak to this congregation and find a way of giving them medical reasons why consuming alcohol is dangerous. Because I've tried everything to let them understand that drinking alcohol is not something God is happy with. But I haven't succeeded. So on Sunday, the medical doctor came to church, and after the reading of the gospel, the priest called on the medical doctor, who came, stood in front of the congregation, put out a table, 2 glasses, empty glasses, and then he took one glass, filled it up with a bottle of water, and took the other glass, filled it up with a bottle of a liquid that was the local gin that people were used to drinking. And then he brought out an earthworm and put the earthworm inside the bottle of water, and people were watching. They didn't know what it was all about, but they saw this earthworm wriggling in the water. And then he took out the earthworm and put it in the second bottle. And as it was wriggling, it died before it got to the bottom of the water. So the experiment was self-evident. But then, instead of the parish priest keeping quiet, he asked the congregation, now what do you think of this experiment? And obviously the man who was the chairman of the local alcohol drinking association looked at the priest and said, you know, this experiment shows very clearly that the more alcohol you drink, the less chances you have of having hookworms in your stomach. You have chosen an intellectually stimulating theme in your Why Democracies Die. And it's very difficult for me to add to what the President of Ghana has already said and what most of the speakers here have had to say. My friend, Professor Julius Ihombere, who actually perhaps one of Africa's leading political scientists, should be standing here instead of the other side. Fragility, a shrinking civil space, and exploring new democratic systems, exploring how democratic systems are weakened and dismantled. But let me make some clarifications to express my concerns before I proceed with my comments. I assume that my keynote address is meant to merely paint a wide brush to some of the thematic issues that I know that more distinguished scholars will be able to deal with, because I believe that they will do most of the heavy lifting. One, because of their experience, and two, because many people have more than just a theoretical experience and understanding of democracy, but a very practical one based on the fact that they've seen this, they've done that, and of course, the first people on the line here can speak to those issues. And only last week, President Goodluck Jonathan himself, about whom I will speak at the end of my paper, but he made the point, which caught the attention of many newspapers in Nigeria, about the politics of treachery and the kind of people who also were close to him, but again, sooner than later, he realized that in this game, there are very few favors that people give. But this is not unexpected, because whereas in other professions, if you want to be a priest, you go to training, you want to be a mechanic, you want to be a barber, every other thing, you want to be a shoe shiner and other things, you have to go and learn. And in many cases, you have to be given a certificate. Politics is the only system that you don't need training and you don't need a certificate. And I think this is what makes politics more dangerous in Africa, because it is an all-commerce game. But I'm a bit worried about the pessimism that is implied in your choice of theme, which is when you say how democracies die. Of course, if you say how democracies die and you invite a bishop, maybe I'm expected to officiate the funeral rites of democracy. But as you will hear from my paper and my presentation, I'm far more optimistic, and I also
Please pardon me and forgive me for the rude interruption, but His Excellency would have to take leave of us now, and so he would like to seek your permission to excuse himself. But because it's a democracy, you have to grant him that permission. So if you're in favor of his departure, please say aye. Mr. President, thank you very much for joining us, and we greatly appreciate your presence. I'm so sorry.
Now, of course, I make the point, and I will speak to the issue of if we say how democracies die, there is no laboratory yet for testing the efficacy of that claim. But of course, one might also make the point that, of course, there are variations in our thematic perceptions, definition, and practice of democracy. And given the shades of contours and the landscape, the question we might need to ask is, which democracy are we really talking about? Because democracy, like music, has various genres of, more or less various themes, because jazz is not calypso, Ghanaian high life is not the same as Nigeria's juju music, hip-hop is not the same as pop, nor is it equal to reggae, funk is neither rock, nor is it jazz. Each of these musical genres elicits different emotional responses and talks to different audiences. Against this backdrop, we might pause and then ask the question, which democracy's death are we really forecasting? And is it the American type, is it the African type, is it the Asian variant, or is it claims that are made elsewhere? For example, the Chinese, many people think that the Chinese don't have a multi-party system. They do have a multi-party system because the Communist Party is a party, but there are also other systems. But what is also very interesting is that the Chinese make a claim which is equivalent to what one of America's famous public intellectuals referred to as manufactured consent, because the Chinese have 8 registered political parties that are supposed to be in opposition, but they are bound never to be against the Communist Party. So yes, they exist. And you can claim that China practices multi-party democracy in the same way that we can say Uganda practices multi-party democracy, or Cameroon, or Rwanda. But in each and every one of these democracies that I've mentioned, you operationalize the concept of opposition at the risk of your life or at your own risk. So to be sure, Africa continues to wallow in a culture of self-deprecating, self-loathing, and self-flagellating lamentations, wondering when we shall ever catch up with the West. Using Western liberal democracy as our models will always leave us feeling that we're not like the Americans, and we're not like the British, and we're not like the Europeans, and therefore there must be something wrong with us. It is this patronizing self-righteousness that enabled President Obama to stand here in June 2012, and he said to the people of Ghana that Africa needs strong institutions, not strong men. Not unexpectedly, Obama received standing ovations, and yet no one bothered to ask President Obama whether there was a necessary contradiction between strong men and strong institutions, or whether weak men had ever built any institutions anywhere. Then as now, to me, President Obama's irritating pontification merely exploited the arrogant and condescending manner that Americans and Europeans have come to view Africa and its development, deliberately ignoring or sidestepping their complicated roles in the sabotaging of democracy across the world. For them, Africans still remain the white man's burden, and that somehow our underdevelopment is a character flaw. Ignoring the exploitative historical processes that have led them to where they are, we are often made to feel inferior and made to ignore the issues of those whose backs these so-called strong institutions were built in Europe and America. Perhaps this feeling that we are failing may have helped the organizers of this conference to frame this conference as a call to democracy's funeral rites. Am I therefore right to assume that the theme of this conference has been inspired by the book, How Democracies Die, authored by 2 American political scientists, Stephen Levinsky and Daniel Ziblatt? Although many Africans, as usual, found inspiration in these cynical views of democracy expressed in the book, many of our people tend to forget that this book is directly a liberal attack at the Trump presidency or America under President Trump. But it is not to deny that there are lessons for us. Rather, the issue is that African scholarship must find reasons to focus on Africa's historical and cultural histories, appreciating that even after 200 years of exploiting others, democracy in America and democracy in Europe and elsewhere is still largely a work in progress. In the course of our assessing progress within democracy, we cannot ignore the savagery, brutality, bloodshed that are now woven into the fabric of our legacies as countries and as a continent in relation to our past. Nor can we ignore the extent to which military rule arrested our march to democracy. Propelled by false narratives of missionary zeal to drive progress, the military marched into state houses across the continent of Africa. The president of Ghana has most eloquently choreographed a lot of that. And yet years of military brutality and bloodshed through endless coups and counter-coups across Africa helped to of misrule resurrected and deepened ethnic consciousness as ethnic blocs sought to use military power and autocracy to institutionalize ethnic or regional hegemonies. Subsequently, in the 90s, after the so-called end of history, half-hearted plans to return our countries to the path of democracy were often marred by the blind ambitions of the military men and women themselves. Their autocracy, they mutated as autocratic dictators, pretending to be democrats, and in my view, debates about the duality of our democracy must therefore be measured against the backdrop of this convenient, convoluted view of history. With all its structural flaws, Africa's march to democracy is seemingly unstoppable. Africans know where they have come from. The future may be uncertain for them, but we have no hope of returning to the Egypt of autocracy and dictatorship that has been our lot. Our two countries, Nigeria and Ghana, remain the best examples. Our people are hungry, they are still poverty-stricken, they are living in destitution, yes. Our democracy has not delivered what it promised to them, yes. Democracy has not made them safe, yes. Democracy has not ended years of oppressive and suffocating corruption, yes. And yes, our people are still caught in the cusp of violence. However, our situation today is evident that our people have nailed their hopes for progress and development on the mask of democracy with all its flaws and very hostile, strong headwinds. It is historic for us in Nigeria that Nigeria has conducted 7 successive back-to-back elections since 1999 till date. These elections have been seriously flawed, been bloody, they have been chaotic, they have been below par. Yet, unlike a few years ago, Nigeria, neither the losers nor frustrated citizens of Nigeria have called the military to stage a coup, as it was, and it has always been the history of our country. Our people have now realized that military rule has proved itself to be a cure worse than the disease, and that the military itself has also realized the institutional damage it suffered from years of being in power. Therefore, the challenge now is for Africans of this generation to ensure that in our hands, the seeds of democracy are nurtured. Because of Nigeria, despite our troubles, despite our uncertainties, it has often been said that Nigeria, the unity of Nigeria is like a Catholic marriage. May not be happy that it doesn't break up. This discussion is timely and auspicious. However, your topic, How Democracies Die, should be replaced by a more hopeful title, How Democracies Can Survive. For indeed, who has ever seen the corpse of a dead democracy, or even once a carcass? Our concerns, of course, should be on how to learn lessons about the consequences of democracy dying and seeking how to avoid what is happening across Africa. Any good driver seeing another car in the ditch after an accident would do well not to pity the car that is in the ditch, but to obey the rules of the road. And there is a saying in Hausa, for those of you who speak Hausa, translated, it says, if you see your brother's beard on fire, put water on your own. Africans must learn that democracy is hard work with no easy answers, not because Africans are not searching well, but because those easy answers are not found anywhere. Revitalizing the civic space by free speech, a free media, and a civil society that is alive to its challenges is the best strategy of keeping authoritarianism at bay and keeping people hopeful. Ahead of Nigeria's return to democracy in 1999, I published a book titled Democracy and Civil Society in Nigeria. And my conclusion in that book, then as now, very simple. That democracy and autocracy cancel themselves out. One cannot exist if the other, both of them cannot coexist, because one's existence defeats the existence of the other. This is neither the time nor the place to debate or define democracy. However, it is important to note that each democratic seed has had its own story of growth, harvest, or failure, depending on where and when it was sown, who nurtured it, on which soil, under what weather, and to what end. By way of definition, the world has come to accept Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg speech definition in 1863, that the democracy is a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, as literally cast in stone. However, on further interrogation, there are gaps in democracy's definition and its operational claims. Once we shift gears to identify geographical locations, cultures, and perceptions of who the people are, and who defines who the people are. And I cannot improve on what President Obasanjo just said, because I told him the quote of what he said should stand side by side with Abraham Lincoln's claim. And what is also very interesting is that Abraham Lincoln delivered this speech in 1863, and it's the same 1963, much later, 100 years later, that Martin Luther King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. And you notice that even in that speech, which was delivered, if you are familiar with Washington, with the statue of Abraham Lincoln, India, when Martin Luther King says 100 years ago, he was referring to the Gettysburg speech. But of course, he makes the point that 100 years later, all the promises that were made or conceptualized in that speech have never really been realized. And I think we can repeat the same thing, that there's always a distinction and a dissonance between the claims of politics and political rhetoric of when people are in campaign and the realities when governance takes off. We could, for example, ask what form of government we are talking about, since every government in the world, whether by ballot or by bullet, ostensibly hangs its toga of legitimacy on the claims that it is for the people. And all you have to do is to read the speeches of, let's say, Nigerian coup plotters from 1966 up till the last one in 1999. I sat down and read all of them. In fact, one of our journalists put them into a book, and it's very interesting. And you ask yourself, what were Nigerians thinking when these people were writing these speeches? In fact, some of the speeches are largely coherent only on one thing. One, the soldiers emphasized their redemptive capacity, but also, very interestingly, you could also see, in fact, there was one coup plotter. Happily, the coup didn't succeed, but the man promised that there was henceforth going to be, what do you call it? The country was going to be under, what is it? What is the word? Under from dawn to dusk. He didn't know the between dusk to dawn. But we would, for example, ask what form of government we're talking about, because every government makes this lofty claim. No one has ever declared up front, either through a coup or through campaign, that his or her ambition in politics is to form a government of myself, for my family, and my kinsmen. The Afrikaners in South Africa, the white supremacists in America, Hitler and his Nazis in Germany, Mussolini and his fascists in Italy, King Leopold who ruled Congo by proxy, all of these men and women through history made altruistic claims. Philosophies like communism, Bolshevism, Stalinism, fascism, Nazism were operational ideological vehicles that conveyed dreams and hopes. And of course, people were enticed, and these people had great followership. They set the clock of democracy back. However, democracy has proved its incredible capacity not to be crushed, because democracy still saw the backs of all of these people. So one of Africa's most distinguished scholars, the late Professor Claude Ake of blessed memory, once argued that the attempt to define democracy presents us with what he calls an anarchy, and attempts to clarify the definition of democracy only adds to the confusion. So by whatever definition, democracy in theory and in practice is about people's ability to participate in determining who governs and how they are governed. I often say that if you see a dead body, you can spread any kind of cloth you want, especially if the body is naked. But if a man is naked and you give him a cloth that he's not happy with, he will still throw it back at you. So fundamental to democracy is the essence that people, although it is flawed, that people have a say in who governs them. At the heart of all of this is that by whatever name we call it, humanity has continued to search for the best ways of ensuring how do we stay safe? How do we raise our families? How do we manage community relations? How do we address such themes as justice, by whatever language, by whatever gender, by whatever ideology? What is justice? What is equity? What is fairness? What is humility? What is respect? These are the principles that undergird democracy. So we're constantly searching for these ideals, and democracy just happens to be, in my view, a scaffolding around which we can hang some of this. And as long as this human quest continues, it is impossible, therefore, for us to talk about democracy ever dying. Another name for political practice of these ideals over time, with patience and sacrifices, leads to the deepening of political culture. Because African democracy focuses only on elections. We don't pay much attention to what happens after the election, but the consistent and persistent repetition of these processes leads to what political scientists refer to as political culture. And when something becomes culture, you don't think about it, you just do it. Respect for elders, if it's culture, you just do it. Nobody has to, prompt you. So for me, fundamental to how democracy grows and is appreciated is the need to develop a political culture. But of course, we accept, and we also know that systemic and consistent interruptions of this process by the military in Africa has created a sense of a culture of cynicism among our people. So if we are concerned about how democracy, like all dreams, we must accept the causes, that the causes are not the same. Because why X died is not the same with why B is alive. Therefore, when we speak of institutional fragility, shrinking spaces, the weakening and dismantling and weakening of democratic system, do we see them as causes or consequences of the death of democracy? In other words, are we perhaps confusing the symptom with the disease? Particular diseases do not kill everyone. Not everybody who is suffering from cancer necessarily dies. Some people live longer. Not everybody people die of malaria. People die of all kinds of things. How do we explain the fact that the same sickness strikes one person, kills a person, but then other people are able? The medical people will tell you it depends on your immune capacity. Therefore, during the period of COVID, for example, the records seem to suggest, not necessarily, but at least that's what the doctors were saying, that most people who died during COVID had other underlying ailments, which COVID simply exploited. And I think we can therefore say the same thing about democracy, that its capacity and ability to survive depends on what are the underlying socio-economic, cultural conditions around which democracy is supposed to grow. In the last 20 or so years, the world has witnessed reversals and decline in many countries in Europe and America. We have witnessed the rise of what is now called illiberal democracies, sustained by right-wing hate groups. We are witnessing the rise of terrorism around the world. Although all of these pose severe threats to democracy, I would rather that we speak of the challenge to democracy rather than its death. In my view, as long as humans exist, there will always be democracy. If we see democracy from the point of view of its leaders, presidents, institutions, parliaments, senators, senate presidents, political associations, political parties, then we can contemplate its death, because all of these institutions are subject to human mortality. However, when we see democracy as part of the human instinct, thirst, hunger, and quest for love, for fairness, for integrity, for a sense of belonging, for community and family, then as long as these ideals exist and they sustain and define humanity, democracy cannot die. The democratic instinct and ethos is already embedded in our DNA. To be sure, politicians and political parties, parliaments, constitutions can be banned or destroyed, as we have seen with autocrats in uniform or out of uniform. But the human instincts that are supposed to nurture cannot die. We can therefore argue that certain types of structures for the pursuit of human happiness, security, and well-being could collapse in the hands of wicked men and women, but others will spring up. Democracies might die in form, just as food, arts, social habits differ among our peoples and countries, but the essence still remains the same. Now, you heard about Nigerians' jollof rice. Ghanaians are free to produce a poor copy, but still jollof rice. But when you know yourself that when you eat jollof rice in Ghana, when you eat jollof rice in Kenya, you know that they are just practicing. The problem of many African countries, but you might say jollof rice is jollof rice, but there are differentiations. The problem with many African countries is that within the system of transitions, landmines that later on exploded to send us back, to the bottom of the hill. So we went through elections, but we never even developed a political culture. Africa transited from colonialism, military dictatorship, but did not successfully transit to democracy. The military often sold many landmines So when Western liberal democracies, which we have adopted across Africa, with their focus on free markets, when we neither have the freedom nor the markets, presupposes a capitalist economy, when we don't have the capital, focusing on such concepts like transparency, accountability, free judiciary, rule of law, and a lot of the elevation